February 2, 2009. A woman walks her dog along the barren outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Her dog stops, digs, and that's when she sees it, something white, something unnatural. She calls the police. What follows unearths one of America's most haunting and unresolved serial killer cases. This is the story of the West Mesa murders. 11 women and an unborn child, all buried in plain sight, all ignored by a system that was supposed to protect them. But who killed them? And why has no one been brought to justice? Tonight, we're going deep into the darkness. You'll be shocked by what really happened in the West Mesa murders. Welcome to the Crime Decoder, Albuquerque, New Mexico, city known for its sunsets, open desert landscapes, and rich culture. But underneath the beauty, something sinister had been festering undetected for years. It was February 2nd, 2009. A typical afternoon. A woman named Christine Ross was taking her dog Ruka for a walk through the dusty mesa near 118th Street SW. She had walked this route before. The land was undeveloped, just a vast stretch of scrub brush, broken glass, and old debris. It was peaceful in its own way. But that day something felt different. As Ruka sniffed around a dry patch of dirt, Christine spotted a bone poking through the earth. Thin, long too large for a dog, too smooth for a coyote. It did not sit right with her. She snapped a photo and sent it to her sister who worked in the medical field. Seconds later, a chilling reply lit up her phone. That looks like a human femur. Phone call to police has been made. Operator 911. What's your emergency, Ross? Hi, I'm on the mesa with my dog. I found a bone sticking out of the ground. I think it might be human. Police arrived quickly. What they initially thought might be an isolated incident quickly spiraled into something much darker. The next day, forensic teams brought in cadaver dogs. The dogs didn't hesitate. They began alerting. Immediately. It's not just in one spot, but dozens. The FBI and Albuquerque Police Department jointly began excavating what would become one of the largest outdoor crime scenes in American history. In total, the remains of 11 women and an unborn baby were discovered, buried in shallow graves across a 92-acre stretch of desert. 11 lives, erased, hidden beneath the surface for nearly a decade. And here's the haunting part. Many of them had been reported missing between 2003 and 2005. Some never had proper missing persons reports filed. Some were assumed to have run away. Most of them were women of color, struggling with poverty, addiction, or sex work. The media dubbed it the West Mesa Bone Collector case. But behind that cold name were real women, real lives, and families still grieving in silence. And with that grisly discovery, Albuquerque was thrust into the national spotlight. The desert had kept its secret for years. Now it was screaming for justice. But this was only the beginning. The story of the West Mesa murders wasn't just about a serial killer. It was about systemic failure, ignored warnings, and a community betrayed by silence. When you hear West Mesa murders, what comes to mind? Maybe it's the bones, the desert, the word serial killer. But behind every forensic label was a woman. And behind every woman, a life interrupted. Jamie Barella, just 15. Evelyn Salazar, a cousin, 27. They vanished together. No one saw them again. Michelle Valdez was 22 and pregnant. It makes 12 souls buried in that sand. Most of the West Mesa victims lived lives at society's edge. Addiction, sex work, poverty. But those circumstances didn't define them. They had dreams. They had families. They were trying. Many entered rehab. Some reconnected with their children, but they lived in a world that gave up on them long before they disappeared. When these women began vanishing between 2001 and 2005, police didn't act fast. Most reports were shrugged off. They were frequent runners, unreliable, street girls. In truth, they were seen as disposable. Even when the disappearances formed a pattern, it wasn't seen as a crisis. Not by law enforcement, not by the press, not by the city. But someone was paying attention. Detective Ida Lopez. She began compiling a list. Names of women vanishing in the same area. Similar backgrounds. all known to walk the streets of East Central Avenue. Ida's list would later become the foundation of the West Mesa murder investigation, but at the time she was alone, understaffed, and overruled. By 2006, construction overtook the desert. Housing boomed. But when the recession hit, it all stopped. The land dried, eroded, and a terrible truth began to surface. What she found wasn't just bones. It was the silence of a city finally broken. 11 women. One unborn child. In a graveyard that had gone unnoticed for years, the West Mesa victims had been forgotten in life and buried in death. But the ground had given them back. And now, the hunt for a killer would begin. When 11 bodies were found buried in the desert of Albuquerque's West Mesa, the entire city was thrown into a storm of fear and speculation. Who could have done this? And more importantly, why hadn't they been caught? This was the beginning of one of America's most chilling cold cases, where the killer was a ghost and the trail was buried beneath layers of time and silence. 11 women, all buried in shallow graves. All disappeared between 2001 and 2005. They had vanished with barely a trace. Some had never even been reported missing. As forensic teams pieced together bones and personal effects, a pattern started to emerge. The victims shared more than just a burial site. They were all women. Most were in their 20s. Many had struggled with substance abuse or were involved in sex work. Most were Hispanic. These commonalities hinted at something sinister. This wasn't random. It was targeted. The media dubbed it the work of a serial killer. But who was he? Early theories ranged from cartels to lone predators. Police initially explored the possibility that these women had been trafficked, murdered, as part of gangland executions. But the manner of burial told a different story. This wasn't a mass dumping. Each body had its own grave. This was ritualistic, deliberate, personal. In a twist worthy of a Hollywood film, one of the biggest breaks came from an unlikely source. Google Earth. In archived satellite imagery from 2003 and 2004, strange tire tracks and patches of disturbed earth could be seen exactly where the remains would later be found. The killer had been operating in plain sight. Hundreds of tips poured in. Police filtered through known offenders, parolees, and residents with violent records. One name that kept surfacing was Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya was a former security guard with a history of violence against sex workers. He lived near the burial site, had been arrested multiple times, but always walked free. In 2006, Montoya was shot dead by the boyfriend of a teenage girl he had allegedly solicited. When police searched his home, they found chilling evidence: ropes, photos, and a suspicious link to one of the victims. Years passed. Promising leads faded into dead ends. And for the families of the victims, closure remained elusive. The fear that gripped Albuquerque didn't fade. It deepened. Was the killer still alive? Still in the area? Watching? This case earned its nickname, the West Mesa Bone Collector. But he's more than just a shadow in true crime folklore. He's real. He hunted these women, buried them in rows like trophies, and then vanished. With every tip, every false lead, the image of the killer becomes clearer, but the name remains unknown. And as we dig deeper into the case, one truth emerges. The system failed these women long before they ended up in the desert. The question that haunts Albuquerque to this day isn't just who killed these women. It's how did he get away with it? 11 women. One unborn child. No witnesses. No DNA. No arrest. From 2001 to 2005, these victims vanished. Some were reported missing, others were not. And when their remains were discovered in 2009, they were already part of a case buried in cold files. He was the name on everyone's list. A man with a pattern and proximity. Lorenzo Montoya lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. He had a long history of violence toward sex workers and had been questioned multiple times during his life. But in December 2006, his story ended violently. He allegedly lured a 19-year-old sex worker to his trailer. Her boyfriend, waiting outside, grew suspicious. When the door opened, Montoya was shot dead. Inside, the young woman was already strangled. Ropes, pornography, bleach, and a camera. It looked like a practice run, or maybe just one of many. Serial killers often operate solo, but in this case, several things didn't add up. The time gaps, the burial site reuse, the varying levels of concealment. Could this have been a team, a ring, a network of men exploiting and discarding vulnerable women? Fred Reynolds was a local photographer. He was known in the sex work community and had a disturbing hobby. He collected pictures of missing women. When police found his stash, it raised alarm bells. Some of the women in his photos were later found at West Mesa, but Reynolds died of natural causes before he could be fully interrogated. Was Reynolds documenting his victims or simply obsessed with them? Another chilling possibility emerged. Was the bone collector already behind bars? One name surfaced: Scott Lee Kimball, a former FBI informant turned killer. He was active during the same years. Another, David Parker Ray, the infamous toy box killer, operated just south of Albuquerque. He died in 2002, but was suspected in multiple unsolved murders of women in the Southwest. Many advocates believe the truth lies not in one man, but in a system that allowed this to happen. Multiple victims had told friends or family they were being watched, stalked, or threatened. Some even named names, but their warnings weren't taken seriously. He is methodical, patient, comfortable with death, and knows the desert. He knew his victims. The truth about the West Mesa bone collector may never be fully known. Was it Montoya Reynolds? Someone else entirely? Or worse, is he still out there? There were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. Yet when they went missing, no one listened. No one searched. No one searched. No one cared. Until it was too late. Between 2001 and 2005, a slow but steady stream of women began disappearing from Albuquerque's South Valley. Many shared common traits: Hispanic, in their 20s and 30s, engaged in sex work, struggling with addiction, and often living on the margins of society. But despite mounting disappearances, few cases made headlines, few sparked community searches, and few were prioritized by local authorities. Their stories faded into the background noise of urban life, until 2009 changed everything. How does a society decide who is worth looking for? In the case of the West Mesa victims, our lifestyles marked by survival, sex work, and drug dependency became the justification for neglect. Former officers have admitted that there was little coordination or urgency. Reports were written and shelved. Families were told their loved ones probably ran off. No Amber Alerts. No statewide mobilization. This wasn't just individual apathy, it was systemic. There was no robust missing persons infrastructure in Albuquerque. No unified system for tracking high-risk disappearances. And no media pressure to force accountability. While law enforcement failed, families fought on. Lorenzo Barella, the father of Jamie Barella, organized his own search efforts. Veronica Romero's sister walked the streets asking sex workers if they'd seen her. These weren't just grieving relatives, they became activists, researchers, warriors. They knocked on doors, called police daily. Some even faced threats for being too loud. Still, they pressed on, demanding that someone, anyone, care. They weren't just fighting a killer, they were fighting a system built to forget their daughters. If these had been wealthy women from the suburbs, would we even be calling it a cold case? From 2003 to 2008, nearly a dozen women disappeared. But national outlets were silent. Local coverage, sporadic. Their names barely made it past the obituaries. Why does the media elevate some victims while ignoring others? Race, class, and perceived morality all play a role. The West Mesa case exposes an uncomfortable reality. Media silence isn't passive. It's an accomplice to injustice. Even after the remains were discovered in 2009, systemic failure didn't end at Evolved. The investigation faced underfunding, DNA testing delays, jurisdictional red tape, and still no one charged. No suspect brought to trial. No justice. Critics point to overwhelmed departments, but that's only half the story. There was no sense of urgency, no interagency task force, until media pressure exploded. In many ways, the system continued to treat these women the way it did in life, as if they didn't matter. Vanished in plain sight. Buried twice, first by their killer, then by silence. We will not let them be forgotten. It looked like an empty stretch of desert, a place no one paid attention to. But buried beneath the dry soil of West Mesa was a graveyard, a secret waiting to be unearthed. This is the chilling story of what was discovered and what was deliberately ignored. The area where the remains were found was a forgotten construction site abandoned by development, but not by evil. The 100-acre site was now a massive crime scene. For months, investigators worked through sun and wind, sifting through dirt for fragments of bone, jewelry, and clothing. They brought in archaeologists, forensic anthropologists, and cadaver dogs. What they found was shocking, not just how many victims there were, but how methodically they'd been buried. Each victim was spaced apart, buried in a similar depth, with signs of deliberate placement suggesting the killer had returned to the site repeatedly over years. Whoever did this knew the land, knew how to hide bodies, knew that no one would be looking. The West Mesa site presented unique forensic nightmares. Most of the remains had been buried for years. Time, weather, and erosion had scattered some bones. Others were missing entirely. But one of the biggest problems was this: forensics was underfunded. The New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator had only a limited number of staff and resources. They had to identify the victims using dental records, tattoos, and partial DNA, and even that took years. It wasn't just a race against time. It was a race against decay, bureaucracy, and disinterest. What's worse, key pieces of evidence may have been overlooked. Some families claim items belonging to victims weren't properly logged. Others say they were never contacted by investigators. Let's talk about what they did find. Most victims were nude, buried with few belongings. One still wore a bracelet, another had earrings. Some showed signs of trauma, others did not. Investigators recovered rope fibers near the graves. They also found a plastic bag believed to be used for suffocation. But perhaps most disturbing, none of the victims were buried with their clothes. Many were last seen wearing identifiable outfits. Where did those go? To some, this suggests the killer kept trophies. To others, it's proof the dump site wasn't the murder site, only a graveyard. So where's the kill room? Where was the staging area? We still don't know. Some evidence in this case vanished. Literally. In 2011, it was discovered that key digital case files related to sex worker surveillance had been accidentally erased. Some tip hotlines weren't recorded. Certain physical items, according to whistleblowers, were mishandled. Was this incompetence? Or something darker? Some retired officers claim leads were ignored. Others say possible suspects were let go due to lack of solid enough evidence despite behavioral matches. We may never know the full extent of what was missed. But one thing is clear: the West Mesa site held answers. And some of them may now be gone forever. The West Mesa field is now a memorial. But beneath the calm wind and desert sun lies the weight of injustice. This wasn't just a dump site. It was a map. A message. A grotesque reminder of lives taken and evidence erased. The bodies were buried in 2009. Files scattered. Leads disappeared. Justice delayed. And to this day, still denied. After the excavation, investigators promised DNA breakthroughs. But 3 years later, thousands of evidence boxes remained sealed or destroyed. Worse, some items went missing. Multiple witnesses called in tips. One described seeing a suspicious white van near Central Ave around the time of several disappearances. Over the next 5 years, 28 evidence hearings, 6 pre-trials, yet still no charges. Ask any prosecutor. Without DNA, motive, or body trauma analysis, convictions are near impossible. A powerful city, fearing scandal, passed internal resolution to keep files and witness statements from public record. By 2014, a dozen families filed lawsuits against evidence destruction and silencing. They wanted subpoenas, new forensic review, and police accountability. They're not suing for compensation. They're suing for truth and transparency. Today, the case is back in courts, but this time with allies: forensic reforms, new DNA testing, and independent oversight. No convictions yet, but justice isn't lost. These families taught us the fight doesn't end in courtrooms or news cycles, it lives on. A decade of silence, haunted families, and unsolved horror. But now hope whispers on the desert wind. New evidence. new allies, and a fight that refuses to be silenced. In 2023, Albuquerque PD broke the silence. A specialized cold case unit was formed, staffed with veteran detectives, crime analysts, and dedicated forensic experts. Their mission? Review evidence, revisit suspects, follow up on old tips, and bring new leads to light. Years after the initial excavation, modern forensic technology has revealed what early investigators couldn't see. These clues are unlocking hidden connections beyond the reach of 2009 array of science. A few months into the unit's work, an anonymous tip landed. Check phone records near 118th and Central in March 2004. One number stands out. Called victims, appears in multiple years. But the subscriber vanished near the same time as the last victim's disappearance. While law enforcement mobilized, families continued fighting tracking-lead themselves, investigating sightings, and coordinating online communities. These citizen sleuths are supplementing official efforts highlighting suspects, photographing potential witness locations, and keeping pressure alive. Reanalyzed evidence, combined with phone logs and witness statements, has led to a new suspect. A construction worker who worked on that abandoned lot in 2003-05. Investigators are reviewing employment records, surveillance footage, and digital footprints, including a second anonymous tip that pinpointed him as suspicious. Charges haven't been filed yet. Law enforcement confirms the investigation is active but silent pending legal process. Still, the reinvigorated case is the first true sign of hope families have seen in years. New clues, new suspects, a police force that refuses to look away. This isn't the end. It's a new beginning. If you know something, no matter how small, reach out. Justice needs all of us. As the sun sets over the West Mesa, the desert keeps its secrets but not forever. Buried beneath the sand were not just bones, but stories, lives, dreams. Women who were daughters, sisters, mothers, and who were forgotten by the very system meant to protect them. But silence doesn't last forever. With new eyes on the case and voices refusing to be ignored, the truth is beginning to rise. Each clue unearthed, each voice amplified, brings us one step closer to justice, one step closer to answers, one step closer to ending the nightmare that began in the shadows. To the families who never gave up, to the victims who never got to speak, we see you, we remember you, and we will not stop until someone answers for what happened on the West Mesa.